Shalom, this is Bill Grammentz. Welcome back to our study, Death in the Hive. This is part 4, Bees as Unclean Swarming Things. In our last session, we saw that davash, honey, actually follows the harvest, not the hive. But, that leaves a pretty critical thread untied. If honey isn't automatically a bee's product, what does Torah actually say about the bee itself? And more importantly, how does answering that question change absolutely everything we assume about what is clean?
To be honest, nobody ever handed me a reason to even ask that question. Nobody sat me down and said, hey, go read what Yahweh says about bees. We all have this kind of historical and cultural blindness when we read texts that we think we already know inside and out. I mean, I had read Leviticus 11 dozens of times in my life, and I had never once slowed down at the section on winged insects. Why would I? There was no obvious reason to look for the bee there. There was no jar of honey sitting on the page pulling my attention toward it. So when I finally did go back and read it carefully, really for a completely different reason, I just wasn't braced for what I found. It wasn't a footnote, it was forceful. Let's look together at what Torah actually says.
In Leviticus, it says, "All winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. Yet among the winged insects that go on all fours, you may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet, with which to hop on the ground. But all other winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you." What we're seeing here is Torah giving us a very specific, checkable test. Not every winged insect fails it. Locusts, crickets, grasshoppers, insects built with those jointed legs made for leaping, those actually pass the test. But think about a bee. A bee doesn't hop. It crawls and it flies. And when I saw that this wasn't just some vague impression, but an actual measurable criterion, something Torah fully expects you to be able to check for yourself, well, that's when this stopped feeling like ancient trivia. It started feeling like something I really had to sit with.
You see, that test sits inside a much bigger category. The Hebrew word is Sheretz. And it isn't just a general word for animals. It's a highly precise legal term for small creatures that swarm and teem, and Scripture applies it very narrowly. In the water, cleanness is defined by fins and scales. Among flying insects, it's defined by those jointed legs we just talked about. And on the ground, they are creeping earth crawlers, with literally no exceptions given at all. 3 distinct domains. And in every single one of them, cleanness is never about how something looks, or how common it is, or even how useful it might be to us. It is solely about whether it meets Yahweh's own stated criteria. I kept looking for a loophole, some way the bee might just squeak by, but it doesn't.
So the bee objectively fails the established test. And because it fails, it definitively falls into the category of Sheretz, that is Tamei, unclean. Now, I fully expected that word. Being unclean is a legal reality we find throughout the dietary instructions, right? But what I absolutely did not expect was that Torah wasn't finished. It does not stop at simply declaring the insect unclean.
Look closely at the phrasing in verse 20 again. It doesn't just stop at calling them unclean. It introduces an even heavier classification. It plainly states, all winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. Detestable. In Hebrew, that word is Sheqetz. Now, I looked this word up expecting to find something mild, maybe a polite, ancient way of saying not preferred or unpleasant, but that isn't what I found at all. Sheqetz is the exact word Ezekiel uses for idols. It doesn't mean please don't. It means you must actively recoil from this. I sat with that for a long time. I realized Torah wasn't just casually placing the bee outside a boundary line. It was demanding an active reaction from us. Not a shrug, but a deliberate distancing.
And the reality is, it keeps climbing. The language escalates even further. When Moses restates the food laws in Deuteronomy 14, he opens by reminding Israel of their core identity. They are a people holy to Yahweh, a set-apart nation. And immediately, based on that holy covenant identity, he commands, "You shall not eat any abomination." He walks through the land animals, the water creatures, the birds, the insects, and he gathers every single one of them under a single, devastating word.
To'eva, abomination. This is the exact same word Scripture uses for the gravest sins, for idolatry, for child sacrifice, for witchcraft. I did not expect an insect classification to be sitting in that kind of company. I mean, our modern sensibilities really struggle with this. We tend to bypass the severity of these ancient categories. But there it was, plainly written in the text.
Tamei, Sheqetz, To'eva, unclean, detestable, abomination. 3 distinct words, and each one is heavier than the last. I certainly hadn't gone looking for any of them. They were simply there, sitting quietly in the text,
waiting this whole time to be noticed.
The prophet Isaiah actually takes this into a profound scene of final judgment. He describes people going through the motions of purifying themselves while eating what he calls the abomination. And he says both groups, the ones eating it and the ones pretending to be set apart while they do, come to the exact same end together. Reading that completely stopped me, because the severity there was never about someone knowingly defying Yahweh out of spite. It was about the gap between what people casually assumed was fine and what Yahweh had actually commanded. And honestly, this is exactly where we have to look in the mirror. How often do we base our definitions of clean and unclean on our own traditions, rather than the precise legal requirements laid out in the text?
And that's where I really had to face something within my own understanding. Now let's be clear, none of this is really about whether I'd sit down and eat a bee. Nobody's tempted by that. That was never the real question. The real question I had been avoiding is this: if the creature itself carries this much biblical weight, does its honey get a free pass? Or was I just never asked to think about it until right now?
Well, it turns out I'm not the first person to feel that exact tension. Jewish tradition wrestled with this long before I ever opened the page. Rabbinic law holds a foundational rule, ha-yotze min ha-tamei, tamei. That simply means what comes from the unclean is unclean. Milk from an unclean animal, forbidden. Eggs from an unclean bird, forbidden. By that exact same foundational rule, honey should have been forbidden too.
But instead, an exception was carved out. And the reasoning behind that exception rested entirely on a very specific claim about the bee itself, that honey wasn't truly something the bee's body produced, but only nectar that it stored and concentrated. I found that almost comforting for a moment. It was comforting because honey is sweet, it's deeply ingrained in our culture and our history, and giving up the idea of it being a blessing would require a massive shift in understanding and in our daily life. It meant even careful, serious scholars had wanted the exact same way out that I wanted. But as we know, comforting isn't the same as true. That claim about the bee is a claim about biology. It can be tested. It either holds up to scrutiny or it doesn't.
Before we test it, though, we have to recognize that Scripture had already given the deeper, ultimate principle long before any of this rabbinic debate began. Job said it first: "Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one." Not rarely, not once it's processed enough, not one. Once I let that verse stand as absolute truth, something shifted in how I had to think about this whole topic. It's no longer on someone to prove the honey is unclean. The burden of proof rests heavily on anyone claiming an exception to show exactly where Yahweh granted it. Bee honey and beeswax were never some accident sitting off to the side of the hive's real purpose. They are the purpose. They are the entire life's work of a creature Torah calls detestable. I didn't go looking for that conclusion. I went looking for an exception, and instead, I found the complete opposite.
So, here is where this actually leaves us. We aren't being asked to choose between modern science and Scripture. We are being given a chance to test the very claim that this centuries-old exception was built on. If honey is merely stored nectar, the exception holds. But if it isn't, if the bee's body actually produces it, then we have a real problem. Will we let what a bee's body actually does speak for itself? We'll put that to the test in our next session.